Chapter 3 Season 2 isn't great.
You can't keep getting away with it! You can't keep getting away with it!
Now, I understand that shitting on Chapter 3's Golden Boys is a bit of a sin, but despite the praise that much of this time period for the game gets, these seasons just didn't age well. With that being said, I do understand why many people like this season specifically, and I want to make an effort to point out the features and aspects that lead many to the conclusion that this season was good, despite it being ultimately flawed. But to better understand where my issues lie, you need to know that I base my season reviews off of 3 main categories: the map, the loot pool, and overall content/quality of life changes. It's important to mention that this is technically part 2 in a 4-part series of reviewing Chapter 3, and while the order you watch these in isn't important, in the end I do plan to explain why I believe Chapter 3 is irredeemable garbage. Like every season during Chapter 3, the loot pool is most responsible for the overall poor construction of the season. Similar to my Chapter 3 Season 1 review, I find it important to reiterate that the loot pool is by far the most important part of a season. I think now many have come to this realization as a result of Chapter 5, because despite the map having many strong locations, the supporting loot pool is rather clunky and makes the game a chore to play. Chapter 3 Season 2 is no different from this trend, as many will recount that Chapter 3's map was some kind of peak of map evolution, which isn't even true for reasons that I'll cover over these videos. However, the loot pools from season to season left many players jaded towards the chapter as a whole. Spray meta is an infestation among Chapter 3's Golden Boys, and the choice for such a cancerous meta is representative of their goals, but ultimately a flawed approach. Epic Games wants to promote an experience where anyone can win, and in an effort to do so, they will add less than balanced changes to ensure that this idea is upheld. Largely, the issue with this is unbalanced weapons don't solve the bigger problem of sweats that they are meant to combat. A worse player, while now more likely to get easy kills or wins due to the implementation of unbalanced weapons, will still end up inevitably losing against a better player with a deeper understanding of the broken meta. The only thing these obnoxious additions accomplish is creating an unskilled and unfair environment for the game, as a lazy fix to increase Little Timmy's skill level. Spray meta, broken items, and overpowered vehicles don't solve Epic's sweat dilemma, and only lead to much resentment on either ends of the Fortnite community. At the launch of the season, Epic decided to vault the MK. The MK was one of 2 weapons that plagued the prior season, and its removal showed some true growth and learning on Epic's end.
Foreshadowing as a narrative device.
Now, I shouldn't get ahead of myself, because while the removal of the MK was a great decision, it was thrown by the wayside to make room for the Striker Burst Assault Rifle, which is also a red dot sight weapon with hit scan and no bloom. In all fairness to this weapon, it's not broken in the same way the MK was. A big part of the MK's issues stem from the fact that it was fully automatic with a high fire rate which allowed it to bleed through walls. The Striker Burst's effectiveness, on the other hand, comes from its high damage with little to no fall off at range, which serves to be somewhat of a trade-off when compared to the MK in that regard. Many would consider the Striker a more powerful weapon than the MK, and while it was certainly broken, it couldn't deal as significant of a blow to the building mechanic like the Prime MK could, which at least in my opinion made it a healthier pick.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
The Ranger at the beginning of the season was given a significant buff, which was another healthy decision, as once again a big issue I had with this weapon was its lack of viability in the prior season. By this point, me prefacing the irony and broken nature of these items might seem a bit tone-deaf considering I have only sang this season's praises so far, but unlike my other season reviews, the good changes for this season's loot pool stop there. Only 1 week into the season, Epic made the very intelligent decision of creating a voting system for returning vaulted items to the game, and for reasons that are beyond me, they included the MK alongside the combat AR.
What the hell are you? No! No!
Just to be clear, neither of these weapons are great, but by far the lesser of the 2 evils is the combat AR. The combat does have a high fire rate with very little bloom. However, it does require some skill as it features a decent bit of recoil. Honestly, during a season that is centered more around shooting than building for the first time in this game's history, it would have made more sense to lean in the direction of weapons that actually take a modicum of skill to use. While I don't believe the combat AR fits very well into this skilled category, so to speak, it does seem like the obvious pick over the MK. It takes more skill, it provides somewhat of a trade-off value, it could lead to more variety in playstyle, and the MK won. If there's anything I've learned from the Fortnite community, it's that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. To an extent, it's also something I can't get too mad at the community for. Giving the community an option between two different weapons like the MK and the combat AR is like asking a toddler to pick between eating candy or fruits and vegetables for a year straight. The obvious option for the toddler is going to be the candy, but similar to the MK in Fortnite, it's not a very healthy decision. These types of decisions really shouldn't be left up to the larger community, and there should be some level of quality and passion that goes into these decisions, rather than forcing people to pick between fruits and candies, or in this case, Dumb and Dumber. To add insult to injury, this re-edition also managed to be an indirect nerf to the Ranger. The idea of including two different types of red dot assault rifles with no bloom, and expecting this weapon to be a viable pick is likely the type of brain rot that started the voting boards in the first place. And by this point, the spray meta this season was at an all-time high, so naturally the best course of action was to add the combat SMG. I've always considered the combat SMG to be essentially a better Stinger. It has better accuracy, does more damage, and has the same fire rates. It's pretty much just a pre-nerf Stinger, with the caveat being that it has a bit of recoil similar to the combat AR. In addition to the combat returning, the Stinger SMG stayed in the loot pool, and similar to last season, it received a damage nerf, however, only by 1 this time. Look, if you need to be told why this weapon is stupid, I suggest you either use your brain or do your homework. And once you're finished, you can submit a 500-word essay in the comments below about how Epic doesn't understand how to nerf the fire rate of a weapon. The shotguns this season in the beginning were messier than last season. The infamous drum shotgun made a return this season, and with its re-inclusion came some damage tweaks, specifically buffs for some reason. These buffs entailed a significant damage increase,
What?
a reduction of the weapon's spread,
No!
a reduction in the damage fall off, and increasing the number of pellets fired during each blast.
You gotta be kidding me. Okay.
Now, just to be entirely accurate with this rework, they did include a nerf to the fire rate from 4 to 3, which definitely was a proportionate response to the buffs. Look, I understand that this weapon wasn't necessarily phenomenal when it was introduced in Season 9, but the problem with an auto-style shotgun is that it's very difficult to balance without outright making them useless. So you want to know what my solution is? Just don't bother with these weapons in the first place. I mean, if it's nearly impossible to balance a weapon without leaning too heavily in one direction, whether that be too broken or too weak, then there are just clearly deep-rooted fundamental issues with the idea of the weapon as a whole. Similar to other disappointments, this weapon shouldn't be allowed back in any season past its initial edition. They tried something new, it didn't work, now it's time to move on. Chapter 3 Season 2 also added the Ranger, which unlike the drum was actually decently balanced. This weapon is somewhat of a code-dependent shotgun as it's a bit gimmicky. Its singular shot with significant damage and high range creates a very high-risk, high-reward situation. I think the major issue was for most of the season, the main two shotguns, the Striker and the Auto, were in desperate need of buffs, and considering the code-dependent nature of the Ranger, it made it difficult to not become aggravated after not having a more consistent option that wasn't gimmicky. However, after the shotgun buffs, a significant amount of my pain that was caused from the prior season was alleviated. I'm not exactly sure why they waited until the closing half of the season to do this, but my personal game theory is that they wanted some cushion to the blow of nerfing Tilted. Oh yeah, they destroyed Tilted again for some reason, but we'll get there when we get there. I will stand by the idea that these shotgun changes should have been implemented with the launch of Season 2. Having to wait until the third major patch for a buff to the shotgun pool is absurd and tainted much of my view towards this season. These changes did serve to be somewhat of an indirect nerf to the overabundance of spray meta polluting the game. Epic fully understands this, and to reiterate what I said at the beginning of the loot pool section, the weapons were intentionally made broken in an effort to give little Timmy or anyone else who hadn't played the game in a while a helping hand. I won't harp on it for much longer, but something that I said in my Chapter 3 Season 1 review was that it would have been more understandable to create a loot pool that features only overpowered weapons, rather than one that caters to only specific SMGs or ARs. The end result still wasn't great, but at least it would have been a similar experience to other seasons, but just with more powerful weapons. The story can be an interesting tool to explain changes that take place on the Fortnite island. Epic uses the story every season to tie in the different reworks to the map in a way that has at the very least some continuity, effectively creating more interest and investment in the evolution of the island and the characters that directly impact the events that change it. However, this season's map changes for the most part are mediocre at best and terrible at the very least. The story this season ties into the map changes heavier than any other season from what I've seen, and is a big factor in the map's slow but sure regression throughout the season. In an effort to promote the war theme of this season, many blimps were added in various locations around the map, and naturally because the blimps were piloted by the bad guys, just about all of them were destroyed by the end of the season. Now, ordinarily I wouldn't have much of an issue with smaller map changes that come and go based off of the season they pertain to. I would consider the drones from Season 9 to be a good example of this, as they create a bit of extra loot and rotation on the map in a way that represents the theme. However, the main difference between Chapter 3 Season 2 and many others that add small landmarks landmarks to better represent the season is that they are very small parts of a larger puzzle. Chapter 3 Season 2's main map changes are the addition of the blimps. No new major landmasses, no new major POIs, just blimps and some smaller named locations with meager loot. The problem is having new massive POIs to support the season pop up out of the blue doesn't fit the timeline for the story very well. This is why the only major POI with the launch of the season was the Fortress, which to be honest is a very misleading name considering it was a drill that didn't feature much loot. The story should never trump gameplay, but unfortunately it was prioritized a bit too heavily this season and resulted in the removal of blimps from different named locations, the demolition of smaller landmarks, and of course the biggest atrocity of all, the destruction of tilted towers. Again.
I can't fucking compete! Can you get the fuck out of my face?
I understand many people like the story, and I completely understand why. I'm not going to pretend that back in Chapter 1, I wasn't interested in what direction Epic was planning on taking their next events, or the locations surrounding them. And in all fairness to this season, the Collider POI was a great addition. But again, naturally, the story conflicts with it staying. I'm not saying every single little detail from the prior season needs to be preserved into the next one. If there are changes that necessitate the removal of landmarks or named locations, then I'm all for it, so long as they replace it with something equally as strong. But as it stands, you can remove Chapter 3 Season 2 from the overall evolution of the chapter, and it would change very little. At the end of the day, the story is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for creating bad map changes or a lack thereof, and shouldn't be prioritized over gameplay. Despite the many issues I've presented for this season so far, something I would like to do for this season specifically is to reach sort of a middle ground with those who enjoyed it. While it has many issues, it's obvious to me that many enjoyed this season for reasons that I think are completely valid. A big part of the praise this season receives is due to the addition of zero builds. I've talked about zero builds in the past and how I believe it saved Fortnite. It creates an environment for those who don't have the time or patience to play upkeep with the building mechanic, but more importantly, it allows old players to return without feeling handicapped and for new ones to adjust to the game. While I have many issues with the way zero build is handled when it comes to splitting the loot pools between it and the builds mode, most of those issues don't heavily impact Chapter 3. For many, zero builds was the saving grace of this game, and I completely understand why many allow it to dictate their view of this season. It reintroduced them to the game and allowed them to experience Fortnite in a way that had never been played before. In addition, the new movement mechanics, tactical sprinting, and mantling are some of the best additions in the game's history, and made movement significantly more polished. Tac sprinting specifically added a bit more of a use case to sliding, which during Season 1 seemed a bit too situational at times, as you couldn't sprint into a slide. The problem is, it's difficult to judge a season based off of the quality of life changes that have been in the game ever since. Yes, the addition of zero build and the new movement mechanics are changes that I am very grateful for. The problem is, the supporting loot pool and map weren't constructed well. This is why I alluded to the idea of the season not aging well, because once you get past the novelty of something new with the quality of life features that were added, what we're left with is a season that doesn't really stand the test of time. We have had countless seasons since then that don't suffer quite as significantly in the loot pool or map department, that all feature zero builds and the quality of life that came with it. Before I end this section, however, it's important that I mention that the tanks were added this season, because if I don't, I know there will be some keyboard warriors in the comments below talking about how I forgot to mention their favorite change. I'll be honest, from everything I've seen, the tanks were very mid. I don't remember much about this vehicle, but the aiming seemed incredibly awkward to the point where if your tank was elevated incorrectly, you couldn't even target your opponent. It dealt a pretty significant amount of damage, but wasn't exactly the easiest vehicle to mow someone down with. I would say in modes with more players it likely performed better similar to other vehicles, however it was overall very slow and seemingly too situational. There are many seasons now that don't present these issues but have carried over much of what was well received from this season in the first place. I'm not saying you're not allowed to like this season, but when questioning its weight, it's important to keep your standards consistent from season to season. Overall, I do understand why many people like this season, even if it's quite flawed on certain levels. The addition of zero builds and the new movement mechanics definitely overshadowed most of this season's issues in the eye of your average player. While I think a lot of the praise for this season comes from the novelty of something new, it definitely reinvigorated many people's interest in the game with these additions, even if the season didn't age well. With that being said, I would likely give this season a 3.5 out of 10. While this season definitely fixed some of the issues with the prior one, by buffing the core shotguns, it really was too little too late. Let me know down in the comments what your ranking of the season would be, or if you disagree with mine. Many of you have been requesting this review for a while now, so I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, by the way, you're all fucking welcome.
I'll make sure not to take as long with the next one, and I'm sure it's a good season this time, right?